Okay, so this is kind of part two of the from Custard's questions. This will be questions on Bavarian chiffon and mousses. I think Joseph kind of paired the two. You can use a lot of the custard bases, creme anglaise and pastry cream and things like that to actually turn into mousses. So they definitely go hand in hand, but let's jump into this. Are there very specific and traditional uses for Bavarian and chiffon creams? And if so, what are the broad and general rules that you do to follow them? Do you use one specific dessert for another one? So when you're thinking of like Bavarian and chiffon creams, they're always fortified with gelatin, usually for Bavarian cream, and Bavarian's usually going to be made with pastry. I'm sorry, not pastry cream. That's diplomat cream. It's going to be made with oh, good grief. Creme anglaise. There we go. The custard sauce. And so gelatin is added to that a lot of times, and then you'll fold in whipped cream. And I think traditionally it's meringue too. I like those bases a lot because they're runnier. And I know it sounds kind of silly, but you have a mousse that's softer in that case. For those softer mousses, I like to use those for molded desserts because they fill in the mold so beautifully, right? So a creme anglaise based mousse works really well, or even a fruit mousse that's kind of runny. I like that softer texture. And when we talk about runny mousses, I don't mean that it's like flat, but I mean that it has some body to it, but you can still pour it out of the bowl or out of the ladle, and it will actually fill up. It'll fill the mold for you. Otherwise, you end up with, if you do molded desserts, you end up with like little potholes on the outsides, and then you got to go back and try to deal with those. You don't want that. You want a mousse that's soft, that's easy to fill, and that works really well. Diplomat cream is something that I did just mention. Diplomat cream is nothing more, and it's one of my favorite mousses. It's pastry cream. Traditionally, it's 1 part pastry cream and 1 part whipped cream. The two are folded together, and boom, you have a mousse. You can include again meringue in that too. Personally, I don't. My personal preference on diplomat cream is 1 part pastry cream, 2 parts whipped cream, unsweetened on the whipped cream. The pastry cream has enough sugar, I think, personally. And then you fold those two together. You can use gelatin if you want, if the mold or if the mousse needs to be stabilized, if it needs to have structure to it. So, you cut a cake and it doesn't run anywhere. If you're going into a cup or something like that, you can just pipe it right in. It doesn't need any gelatin. So, ratios for gelatin leaves is the next part. So Joseph had a good question. He can't find anywhere where there's a ratio for gelatin leaves products to be thickened, and does acidity and basic qualities affect the point necessary for adjustment. So gelatin, there's not like solid steadfast rules. Here's a good rule to go by. 1 cup of, or about 250 grams of water is going to be jellified very lightly by 1 sheet of gelatin. That's very lightly, like very lightly. If you want that to be stronger, you go 2 sheets, right? So for kind of a ballpark, for every 1 quart of product, 4 sheets of gelatin should jellify it slightly. Yes, that changes when you start including acids in there. Yes, that it changes when you include alcohols in there. It makes the effectiveness of the gelatin less, but you can bump it up from there. So my buddy always used to say 3 sheets of gelatin per pound of product for a base. He's probably pretty damn close. So like for every 1 pint of product, if you use 3 sheets of gelatin, especially for mousses, you can get there from where that goes. So it's not a steadfast rule. It's something you kind of got to play with a little bit too. I know, especially when I was younger, I would over gellify everything. Everything had a bouncy texture because I was scared that it was just going to run all over the place, and that's never a fun place to be. Now I take my chances a little bit more. Sometimes I'll just throw in an extra sheet for good measure, but there we are. Do you have any self-held policies concerning Pata Bomb use versus Italian meringue use? Yeah, I do. So Pata Bomb, because the fats are actually in there, I like Pata Bombs, especially in like chocolate mousses and things that already have fat in the base. That's my preference to it. Even creme anglaise has fat in the base, and that works nice. Italian meringue I like to use for desserts that don't have fat in the base. So like a fruit puree mousse or something like that would be really nice for Italian meringue. That's just me. You probably could very easily change that with pretty good success on that one. If molding a mousse, do you chill it in the fridge only to set, or do you freeze it and then refrigerate it? Are there items that you should not be putting in a pastry that is to be frozen. So with a molded mousse, and we're going to pretend we're using the silicone molds like dome molds or something along those lines, you freeze those things as hard as you can. I mean, I want them rock solid. Overnight freezes are the best. You can use a blast freezer to take things out. The harder that product is when you remove it from the mold, the less likely the mold is going to do damage to the product. Less expensive molds tend to be thicker, and they damage mousses really, really well or really poorly. Both. Yeah, they beat them up pretty bad. So I like them to have them like rock hard, do them the day ahead of time, or put them in a blast freezer for a good solid 4 hours. Yeah, they need to be hard. When you take them out, you want them rock hard. And then you can let them thaw out in the refrigerator. That's fine. But I like to work with them basically when they're frozen the entire time. The only time I will thaw them is even after they're glazed or sprayed or whatever. At that point, then I'll thaw them out in the fridge and serve them. But they should be really hard. One thing that affects the unmolding of a mousse from any type of mold, especially silicone, greatly is sugar. If you have a product that has a lot of sugar in it, it's going to make that freezing temperature drop. And so you're going to end up with a softer product. That's like ice cream. The reason ice cream stays creamy isn't because of the cream. It's because there's more sugar in it, right? It's because that elasticity on the palate. I mean, there's stabilizers that you can use too to give that kind of stretchiness on the palate. But to keep it soft anyway, you keep adding more sugar. And eventually you'll add so much sugar that the damn thing just won't freeze at all. And mousses it'll happen with too. So like Italian meringue has a shit ton of sugar in it. If you add all that sugar in there, you're going to end up with something that's pretty soft. That's why, a lot of times I'll default to using more whipped cream if I'm doing a frozen and unmolded dessert over Italian meringue because it doesn't unmold easily. If you want something that unmolds very, very easily, you can simply freeze it into like a small hockey puck mold, we call them, or cylindrical metal mold. Freeze those, and if they do have a lot of sugar, they'll still drop out because you use a blowtorch to heat the outside, and so it melts that tiny barrier of mousse and it'll drop right down, no problem. But when you get those high sugar quantities in those silicone molds, it can be kind of dangerous. Here we go. So we're on to F here. White chocolate mousse doesn't have any additional fat, while dark chocolates are usually combined with butter. Is this just to compensate for the lack of fat in dark chocolate while white chocolate already has a sufficient amount? Or do some white chocolate cream and mousse recipes call for additional fat? So when I make a white chocolate mousse specifically, I'll make a white chocolate ganache first. And that will be, I'll melt my white chocolate first. I usually will do like a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 parts white chocolate to 1 part cream. And that is butter fat being added right there in its case. It's also making a little bit of an emulsion. I don't make a lot of white chocolate mousses like just themselves. I do add white chocolate to a lot of my citrus mousses though. So for instance, if I make a lemon curd, I'll leave the butter out at the end and I'll launch white chocolate into it. Stir those together. Maybe I'll put gelatin in at that point too. And then what you have is like a lemon curd still warm, or at least at room temperature at this point with it has gelatin in there. It has cocoa butter from the white chocolate. And it also, that cocoa butter, I don't know, I think white chocolate and the cocoa butter flavor with citrus is just delicious. I think they're great together. I think white chocolate in on itself is kind of boring. But when you add it with the citrusy notes or with other sour notes and flavors, that something that has a strong perfume, I think they complement each other really well. And so that's when I use my white chocolate mousses. So I don't add any extra fat other than the cream that I'm adding, which, if you have good cream, it's going to be 40% butter fat in there anyway. Plus you're folding a whole bunch of white chocolate in after that. So maybe that's one of the reasons. But all right. As a general rule, do you always use Italian meringue in coulis-based mousse to do the necessary stability, or the meringue? Let me read this one again. As a general rule, do you always use Italian meringue in coulis-based mousses, duo, to the necessary stability, or the meringue? So for a general rule for coulis-based mousses, and I think I mentioned this just a little bit earlier, I would use Italian meringue in that. And in the process that I fold it in is you'd have your coulis first, and your coulis is a fruit puree, if you don't know. Fruit puree that's been sweetened, thickened a little bit, maybe with cornstarch even, just something that easy. You can hit it with a little bit of gelatin at that point, and then you can, I like to use a whisk to fold in my meringues because, it's protein, so it breaks, it kind of crumbles a little bit, even if has a ton of sugar, which this will. So I fold in my meringue next, and then I'll fold in my cream last. And that's the order that I'll go in for that. And I think, so Italian meringue has the capability, because one, it has a ton of sugar and it has a lot of water in it from the eggs, has the capability of delivering those water-soluble flavors that fruits carry in them so well to the palate, much better than whipped cream does. Whipped cream kind of adds that luxury point, because it's whipped cream, it's good. But that Italian meringue is sugar, and when it's dissolved, sugar kind of acts like water and picks up a lot of those flavors too. But it'll deliver those fruit-based or that coulis-based flavors a lot. All right, cool. I'm glad this one came up. A cream like Creme Boost call for specific temperature controls for the components while adding the others. Is this necessary or not so much? Or only necessary for certain things? Do you hold any temp controlling as necessary for anything to make in particular? So here's what I kind of think for temperatures. There is a really sweet spot zone with your bases, especially. Your base for basically chocolate and gelatin kind of works the same way. Needs to be between 80 and 100 degrees before you fold in any of your aerated products, whether it's your meringue or whether it's your cream. The reason that it needs to be that spot, and if you can get it in that 90 zone, it's 90, and this is all Fahrenheit. If you can get in that 90 zone, that's the sweetest spot of all, because it's kind of like chocolate will still be melted. Your cocoa, you're not worried about your cocoa butter crystallizing. Gelatin is still melted at that point, but also you're not adding a whole bunch of hot liquid into your cream base, because if you take that, your hot base, say it's a ganache, and it's 110 degrees, and you start folding whipped cream into it, it immediately melts the butter fats that are in the whipped cream that are holding the air. So the whole thing deflates, right? So that was too hot, all the things, and you'll notice you end up with a mousse that's much more dense. If it's too cold, then you end up with something that's bad. It's like crumbly and mealy and not fun. So that zone is kind of a sweet spot. Again, I know I said 80 to 100, aim for 90. I just think it's a great temperature. Cream doesn't freak out, and the cream is cooling the base as it's being folded in, and all this, they just get along a lot better. So I hope that answered that question. Creme Boost also, I don't know if there's further questions, but it's kind of an amazing product. Creme Boost is only pastry cream or creme anglaise. I like pastry cream personally, with gelatin in it, and then you fold meringue into it. There's no whipped cream into it. And it's cool because you can actually take that, because there's no extra butter fat that's been whipped, you can take that mousse, Creme Boost, and then sprinkle sugar on the top of it and caramelize it like a creme brulee, and it will actually caramelize on the top. It's a really cool dessert. I don't know, just neat. Old school, but awesome. While producing meringues, do you do anything different than standard ratios of sugar to egg whites that are laid out in the book? The book says that Swiss and Italian sugar ratios vary. Do you use the ratio from the book, or also vary the relative, and what would you vary it for? Is the sugar content for a hard French meringue only served to make the meringue crispy when baked? So my basic premise when it comes to meringues is still the traditional 2-to-1 ratio. I know it's a lot of sugar, I know. 2 parts sugar to 1 part egg whites, that's the traditional one. I'll vary sometimes and go like 1 to 1.5. I would never really go below 1 to 1. But then it depends what you want you're using your meringue for too. So I don't want to be like, there's not a hard and steadfast rule. Usually when I think of standard Italian or standard Swiss meringue, I still think 2 to 1. I still think that pillowy, super soft, and sugar gives meringue that like extra smooth, kind of beautiful kind of glimmer to it. It looks like that soft snow, rather than, the more you drop the sugar in it, say you go to a 1 to 1, you end up with a crumbly texture. But again, you have to kind of assess what you're going to use that for. And then the last question that was a part of that was French meringue only served to make crispy meringues. Basically, I only use French meringue to make crispy baked meringues. If I'm going to do something and I want it easy, I'll use Swiss meringue because it's over a double boiler and it comes out lovely and fluffy. Italian meringue is great. It's just like extra work sometimes, and you just don't always need that. But it does offer a ton of stability. And for all of them, I will use cream of tartar or some sort of an acid so that it begins to kind of break down the proteins and help them get restructured when you're whipping them. That does help. What do they call that? Not destructured, denatured. There we go, denaturing the protein. All right, so the last question here. What personal method do you use to avoid crystallization for Italian meringue? Are there any other tricks? This meringue is a weak spot of mine. So with Italian meringue, a lot of the books will say, you cook it to 250 and 255 even. I cook my sugar to 240 degrees and I pull it off that heat and I get going with it right away. I think that 240 degrees is hot enough. I think it also prevents crystallization. And I think the crystallization you're talking about, Joseph, and I'll give two reasons, is probably when you pour it into the pot, when the whisk goes around and it turns to like a million shards of glass and wants to destroy everything in the pot and your soul as well. So you can pull it early. You can also, if it's crystallizing in the pan, add some corn syrup. And we're talking like a tablespoon. Again, it depends on how much you're doing, but if you're doing a lot, then add a lot. But you can add a little bit of corn syrup. The structure, the crystalline structure of the corn syrup will help prevent, it doesn't always, it's not 100%, but we're talking like 90% insurance, which is pretty damn good. It will help prevent that structure from setting up on that. So hopefully that answered some questions. Thanks for all these really good questions, Joseph. If anybody else out there watched this one, thanks for playing along, and hopefully we get to do this again in the future.